It is my great pleasure now to introduce to you the Honorable Tom Andrews. Tom Andrews is the President and Chief Executive Officer of United to End Genocide. He's a former congressman from Maine and most recently served as National Director of Win Without War, a coalition of 40 national organizations promoting a more progressive national security strategy that calls for prudent use of military engagement. He's worked to promote democracy and human rights throughout the world, including Indonesia, Cambodia, Yemen, Algeria, Serbia, and Ukraine, among many others. A longtime advocate of democracy and human rights in Burma, Tom facilitated the creation of the European Burma Network and served as General Secretary of the Nobel Peace Laureate Campaign for Aung San Suu Kyi. Tom is a senior advisor to the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs, chaired by former U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. Tom was elected to the Maine House of Representatives in '82, the Maine Senate in '84, and the United States House of Representatives in 1990. Ladies and gentlemen, the Honorable Tom Andrews.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, Devin, and thank you, everyone. Did you notice that just before Devin introduced me, he said that we were running out of time, which I think might have been a signal. I think the organizers, it was very gracious of them to welcome me and to invite me, and it's really an honor to be here today, but I think they might have been a little nervous given my background as 12 years in public office. As my friends say, I'm a recovering politician, and at any moment I can break out into a political speech. So just be forewarned, but I'm going to try to condense my 2-hour speech, Devin, into a smaller nugget, given the fact that we're running out of time. It really is an honor to be here. Assalamu alaikum. And I want to tell you that the Dr. Stanton, who spoke before me, and Matt Smith, who will speak after me, are such champions of human rights and have done so much to advance the principles and the values that fill this room and fill the audience watching us today. And it's really an honor to be with them and to be with others who are on the front lines of this tremendous challenge that we're talking about today. I want to put this, what you've heard today, the horror that you've heard about today, the images that we've seen on the screen and the testimony that we've heard, in a bit of perspective. And the first perspective is that things are bad in Burma. In the last 6 months, I've spent over 6 weeks in Burma. Much of that time I have spent traveling the country to see for my own eyes what's been happening. 3 trips to Rakhine State, spent days in the camps to see for myself, and to then travel to Naypyidaw, travel to other parts of the country to talk to a range of political leaders. And I want to tell you that things are bad and they're going to get worse. Not only because of this evolving horror and the mechanisms that have been in place and are in place to maintain and strengthen the positions of those who are committing these atrocities, but also because of other dynamics, including the fact that next year, 2015, there will be national elections. And I can tell you that when there are national elections, and if you look at mass atrocities, genocides, crimes against humanity, very often you see a pattern between outbreaks of violence and elections, and the great tensions that sometimes can flare up into violence circulating around elections. And I can tell you that the politicians that will be running for national office in Burma will not be the first to use the darkest of our human nature to appeal to for power, fear. Fear. The politics of division and hatred and bigotry. We've certainly seen those politics here in the United States. We've seen them in other nations of the world, and we're seeing them right now in Burma. And I can tell you, as the election gets closer, the danger is going to intensify. So it's a challenge for us to act, and the challenge for us to act is to act now, before what could happen happens. The challenge we're also facing here in the United States is this narrative that we've had to confront, the good news narrative of Burma. Burma has become a source of pride to many in Washington. The Obama administration recognizes or considers Burma, its policy toward Burma, as one of its great foreign policy achievements. And of course, if you're familiar with the history of the rule in that country, the horrendous turmoil, repression and oppression suffered by the people of Burma at the hands of the military regime for years and years and years, then you have to recognize, yes, indeed, there has been some progress. Aung San Suu Kyi is no longer in prison. Aung San Suu Kyi is no longer under house arrest. She is in parliament. That is progress. There are no longer thousands and thousands of political prisoners. You can speak more freely than ever before. Now, all this is in context, by the way. I mean, if I could, if I had the time, if Devin would allow me, I'd talk a lot about how the veneer of the political reform that exists in Burma. How, for example, I mean, you are allowed to protest, you're allowed to go out and organize and speak up if you're in Burma, but you have to not only get a permit to do it, you have to get your slogans pre-approved before you go out and speak. Now, I mean, this is the thing. I mean, there's a democracy, but 25% of the seats in the parliament are guaranteed to the military. And you can't change the Constitution unless you have more than 75% of the parliament support, and on and on and on and on. But it's progress, yes, from what there was before. But the fact is, it is incremental and reversible progress. And I think that one of the great mistakes of the Obama administration has been to respond to the incremental progress of reform without incremental lifting of political, economic, and diplomatic pressure. Instead, they lifted that pressure almost wholesale and left themselves with very precious few points of leverage if, in fact, the reform that we saw beginning a few years ago was to be reversed. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was a mistake that we're paying for today. So we have a great challenge in that we have an important step to take in terms of addressing this situation. We have circumstances on the ground that are dangerous and getting more so. And we have, let's face it, in Burma, there is a very, very precious sources of leverage on this government and all that it is doing. Very few sources of pressure internally. So that means that we as a community outside of Burma, in the international community, have an even greater obligation because we are the source of leverage that is going to matter to this regime, and no country is in a stronger position to lead and exert that leverage than the United States of America. So those of us who are Americans have an especially big obligation to take action. I'm going to take off my watch so I can just kind of make sure I'm not going way off. I am here to speak to you today as the president of United to End Genocide. We are a group of 500,000 people from throughout the country and nations around the world that have one mission, and that is stopping and preventing genocide and mass atrocities. And when I first when the organization was formed and I became its president, I took a trip to Africa and I went to Rwanda, where this year we are celebrating, we are recognizing the genocide that inflicted those innocent people in Rwanda. And as we think about what happened 20 years ago, I thought those very thoughts when I went to Kigali in Rwanda, and I stood at the Kigali Memorial Museum and Center, and I stood with the bodies of 250,000 victims who were buried all around the center, and I went and looked at the exhibits, And I examined them, and I said to myself, and I literally had to sit down. I'm not proud of this. But I had to sit down, and I looked at this incredible story before my eyes, and I said, my God, I was in Congress when all of that was going on. I was a member of the Armed Services Committee. I was in Democratic leadership. Where was I? Where the hell was I? How could we as a nation, how could we as a world allow this to go on? This massive slaughter, this genocide of so many innocent people, when we could have done something about it. Where was I? And I thought back to the dynamic in 1994. I was running for the United States Senate. It was a very hot political year, very contentious. The economy was on its heels. Lots of political, partisan polarization going on. And somehow or other, Rwanda never came up in that political context. Never, as Greg Stanton had suggested, at any of my town hall meetings or campaign events, did anyone raise their hand and say, what about the people of Rwanda? What are you and what are we doing about it, and what are we going to do about it? And so I recognized how important it is for there to be a political constituency in this country who will stand up and ask those difficult questions, who will demand of our political leaders that we have a responsibility, a moral responsibility, to stand up and say, no, we will not allow this to happen. And Mr. President and members of Congress, you need to be hearing from us in 2014 that no, we will no longer allow this to happen to the Rohingya people over in Burma. We will not allow it to happen. And you know, I went also in that trip to Kenya, and I asked the people in Kenya, in 2008, Kenya, as you might recall, came very close to a massive conflagration of violence. There was some significant violence, many people died, but it was about to blow way up and create a huge catastrophe, but it was stopped. And I visited with those who were on the front lines of helping to make that stop and to save untold numbers of people. And I said, what was it that was critical to you and to those working with you to save those people who were in harm's way during those very contentious times around the 2008 elections in Kenya? And they looked at me. This was a consistent pattern of my conversations. They looked at me and they said, you. Not me personally, but you, the world, were paying attention. You, the United States, was paying attention. And because we knew, and the leaders of all the various sides knew that you were paying attention, it made a huge difference in creating the conditions within Kenya for a resolution, a way out of the violence to be identified and seen. So it is critically important for the world and for the United States to stand up and recognize what's going on, the unique role that we have to do something about it, and to make it part of the political agenda in this country. Because, as we have seen in cases like in Kenya, it can save untold numbers of lives. Greg Stanton was just talking about the various factors that he identified and is so plain to see that are driving this horrendous story. We called it, in a publication that we put out a few weeks ago following one of my trips to Burma, Marching to Genocide in Burma, the various factors that you've heard. But, you know, I was over there, and while I was over there, it was when the government decided to throw out of Burma Doctors Without Borders. And I had been to the camps before then. I had met a lot of people. So then I went right back to the camps. And I went to some of the villages surrounding this area that had Rohingya people, and I interviewed them. I must have talked to dozens of them who were receiving treatment for a variety of ailments, large and small, but who were told that they no longer had access to medical care. A farmer who had an emergency appendectomy, and he couldn't get any care, health care, during his recovery period, and it created some symptoms had developed and some abscess, and he was getting weaker, and he needed desperate medical attention that didn't exist. Or the little girl who had been operated on and had a tumor taken out of her leg and was suffering and needing care. Or the man who had lost his limb and was 4 days away from running out of pain medication. Or the young man suffering from AIDS, or the young child suffering from tuberculosis who needed desperate care in order to stay alive. And the only source of health care available to any of those people and their families was Doctors Without Borders. And the government threw them out. Now, lest you have any doubt about the role of government, and Matt Smith in Fortified Rights did an incredible job in making very clear the intentions in disclosing documents that weren't known before, or the clear intentions of government officials. But here it is. Talk about systematically harming, destroying, in whole or in part, a people because of their ethnicity, or the God who they pray to. The people and the families who I met and sat in their homes were going to die. Not because of any condition that they had or anything that could not save them, because it was beyond the hope of medical treatment. It was because of an edict of the government that Doctors Without Borders could no longer service those people. And why is it, I asked, was that decision made? Did you know this? Did you know this? There were two public reasons that the government gave for throwing Doctors Without Borders out of all of Rakhine State. By the way, it's not just the camps, it's all of Rakhine State. 500 healthcare workers thrown out. 400,000 consultations in Rakhine State last year alone. 10,000 malaria victims needing healthcare right now. The first reason was because someone on the Doctors Without Borders staff told the truth about treating people for gunshot wounds and other wounds sustained in a massacre that the government claimed and claims never happened. That was the first reason. They told the truth. And the second reason, this is the public reason, by the way, this is the public reason. The second public reason was because Doctors Without Borders had the audacity to hire Rohingya staff to help them in caring for Rohingya people. That was the second public reason why they were thrown out of all of Rakhine State. So the consequences on so many levels are horrific. I went back there a few weeks ago and revisited the families that I had visited before. And I mourned with the family whose husband and father of 5 children, the man who had the emergency appendectomy that I told you about, we mourned his passing. And they sobbed as I showed the photographs I had taken of him with the family. And thank God, one of the children that was suffering from pneumonia, acute pneumonia, had a very high temperature, somehow miraculously survived. The child with the tumor can't walk. Can't walk. And a little boy who was one of those impy kids, you're going there, you know, I just would always get, there'd be this huge group of kids. Wherever I would go in the camps, they would all come out and they'd all, follow the funny-looking white guy, with the camera. And there was one kid in particular, this impy little kid, always kind of fooling around and jumping in front of the camera with this wonderful energy. Well, he'd been diagnosed with TB. And he didn't have any treatment available with the expulsion of Doctors Without Borders. And when I went back to see him and his family, he was a shell of himself, emaciated, very sick. And he is probably going to die. Well, the good news, from my point of view, was that, and is that there are members of the public organizations like the ones you're hearing from today, who take this very seriously. And yes, there are members of Congress in both political parties who care about this. And I want to tell you, it was an incredible experience. I returned from the camps. I was in Rangoon, and I was looking on my computer. I finally got some access, and I went to the floor of the House of Representatives, and there on the floor of the United States House of Representatives were the very photographs of the very people I was just describing to you on the floor of the House. And there were members of Congress saying, these are not statistics, these are people with real families and real consequences to what's going on, the horror that's going on. And imagine if these were your children, your family, your mother, your father, your son, suffering from this. And there they were, large pictures from Burma, from the camps, from Rakhine on the floor of the House of Representatives, and the House of Representatives passed unanimously with Democrat and Republican support this resolution, condemning not only the government of Burma, but calling upon the United States and the Obama administration to pressure this government in Burma to change course. In addition to the loss of health care, of course, is the loss of witnesses that this horrific decision represents. The fact that people are systematically being denied access who could provide independent eyes. So those 500 workers that were thrown out, along with Doctors Without Borders, are 1,000 eyes that could otherwise be witnessing. And this, when I talked to those workers in Sitwe and the region, they said that this was one of the most terrifying things of all. Because we're not going to be able to see, and I said, you're not going to be able to see what? We're not going to be able to see and witness the violence that's coming. They're systematically getting rid of those who would otherwise be able to provide testimony to the world. It's a horrendous situation. And you know, President Obama, in November of 2012, went to Burma with Secretary Clinton, very well publicized. You remember them walking down the tarmac and so forth. And he met with President Thein Sein, and President Thein Sein made 11 promises to him, 11 commitments. And one of those commitments was to open up Burma to the High Commissioner for Human Rights so that they could open up a permanent office, permanently staffed, ready and full access anywhere in the country. And of course, that promise was not kept. And of course, of the 11 promises that were kept, only one has been completely fulfilled. We have in the back of the room, and we have online, we kind of chronicled them. It's called Burma's Broken Commitments. And this is the kind of impunity. You say things, you make commitments, and then you do nothing about them. And of course, that's not surprising. I'm not shocked that this is all going on. But what about the United States? What about the international community? Can we just turn our back and allow this to go on with impunity? These people have got to be held accountable. And ladies and gentlemen, those officials in the United States that are turning their backs on those commitments, they have to be held accountable too. And that's our job. And that's our job. Okay. So what are we going to do? And I'm about to break into that political speech, and Matt Smith's getting even more nervous down here. So I'm gonna try to wrap up within the next hour. But what are we going to do? What are we going to do? Well, the first thing, as you've heard and we've witnessed, and there was Nicholas Kristof and some of the great work that he has done in Burma, just returning. If you haven't seen Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times, his pieces and his video, I highly recommend that you look at. People need to know. We need to get the word out. We've got to get these stories out. We've got to get this message out. People have to become aware. The light of truth have to be shined here. And then secondly, action needs to be demanded. We need to take and confront that good news narrative that has been so pervasive in Washington. And we need to break it apart with the reality of Burma today. And I've got some interesting news. in that respect in the halls of Washington, and that's where I live 2 blocks from the Capitol. I can tell you that people are now, even some of the staunchest believers in that good news narrative, are now beginning to seriously question what's going on when they learn that, of course, part of that narrative is that Aung San Suu Kyi will be allowed to run for president, Aung San Suu Kyi will become the president, and there'll be constitutional reform that will take away the military authority of it. And, of course, now everyone's beginning to realize that's not going to happen. That's not going to happen. They're not going to, they'll create a vision, a mirage of change, but they're not going to give up real power. So now there's some openings to that wall that we were facing for so many years of the good news, no things. And boy, I'll tell you, if I had a nickel for every time I heard this, I'd be a rich guy. And they'd say, look, you just got to understand what all of Burma has been through. There's tremendous changes going on. Be patient. Rome wasn't built in a day. Be patient. Things are moving in the right direction. No, they're not. They're moving in the wrong direction. And the evidence of that becomes clearer and clearer every day. So we have to be just the opposite. We have to be impatient with those who are standing in the way in Burma and impatient with those who are letting them get away with it right now. Okay, we had a great success. People in this room, others, literally thousands of phone calls came in to members of Congress when the joint resolution was proposed in advance. It went through the Foreign Affairs Committee. It was passed out of there unanimously. It went to the floor of the House. The faces of the Rohingya and stories of the Rohingya were on the floor of the House when that was passed. That was a great success. And of course, we learn in organizing, nothing succeeds like success. You got to realize that despite the fact that we've got this tremendous challenge and these difficulties in meeting them before us, there is success. There's tangible demonstrations of movement forward, and we've got to build on them. Now, the Senate is the next step. We heard a speaker today refer to the United States Senate. Chairman Bob Menendez of the Foreign Relations Committee, I hope I'm not speaking out of school, is about to introduce a companion resolution in the United States Senate. And that Senate bill, I've heard from some Republican senators, have an interest in joining on that as well. And so in the very near future, we're going to see a companion bill in the United States Senate. The chairman of the House Subcommittee on Asia and the Pacific, Steve Chabot, who was on the floor showing these pictures and leading the charge for that joint resolution to be passed, he is introducing new legislation into the House, the Burma Human Rights and Democracy Act, in which this movement toward embracing the military and forging closer links between the U.S. Pentagon and the military of Burma will be stopped, and in which there'll be demands of accountability demanded of the government of Burma before this progress continues to be allowed forward. We have a petition to the president that has been circulating around our community, and we're hoping to get that circulated among the community here. And I thought I brought one up, and I did bring one up. Here it is. We have a hard copy here in the hall, but you can also go to www.endgenocide.org. This is an appeal to the President of the United States to change course and to begin to put the necessary pressure on the military government of Burma, and to do it now. We've now eclipsed the 10,000 signer mark, and we want to do much better. So with you taking this, filling it out, giving this back to us, we will make sure this gets to the President of the United States, but even more importantly, to spread this out. www.endgenocide.org. Get these petitions, sign them, and pass them to your friends and family. And let's begin to demonstrate to the President and to the White House, as well as to the Congress, that there is a constituency that gives a damn about what's going on in parts of the world where people are under siege, like in Rakhine State in Burma. When I was growing up, I'm going to date myself now, when I was a young man, I was inspired by some great leaders. And one of them was a U.S. Senator and Attorney General by the name of Bobby Kennedy. And Bobby Kennedy had this to say to a group of students in Soweto, South Africa in June of 1966. And this is how I'm going to end. It is from the numberless, diverse acts of courage and belief that human history is shaped. Each time a man or a woman stands up for an ideal or acts to improve the lots of others or strikes out against injustice, he or she sends forth a tiny ripple of hope. And crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring, those ripples build a current that can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance. That generation of young people in South Africa overcame the oppression and resistance of apartheid in South Africa. We too can bring down, as Greg said, we too can have hope, we too can and we will win. But let's not just make ripples, as Bobby Kennedy suggested. Let's make waves on behalf of the Rohingya in Burma. Thanks so very much.